Baruchim Abba, and welcome everyone to a special edition of All Parsha, Parshas Balak. The Ramban on Parshas Balak. We would like to examine two fundamental analysis of the Ramban on the Parsha. Let us begin in Perek Chaf Beis, Pasuk Daled. The Parsha tells us that Balak saw everything that Klal Yisrael did to the Emoiri, and Moav was very afraid because Klal Yisrael was very numerous. Moav became so frightened that they became disgusted with their own life. And therefore Moav sent message to the Ziknei Midian. The Ramban is bothered. This is such an important issue. This is an issue of such fundamental significance. So why are the Ziknei Moav sending a message? Why is Moav sending a message to the Ziknei Midian? Why don't they send a message to the kings of Midian? We know that Midian had 5 kings, so send it to the top. Why are they sending it to the Zikanim? And the Ramban says, Ziknei Midian, Amar Rabbi Avram, he begins by quoting the Ibn Ezra's Pshat, Yitachein, it's possible, Shahayu hachamisha malachim Zikanim. The reason why they're called the Ziknei Midian is they were the kings, but these kings happen to have been old, or Zikanim perhaps refers to wise people, and it calls them Ziknei even though they were malachim. Now, the Imkain, according to the Ibn Ezra, Vayelchu Ziknei Moav v'Ziknei Midian. Later on, in Pasuk Zayin, when the Pasuk says the Ziknei Moav went with the Ziknei Midian, these are not the same Zikanim, because in the very next Pasuk, Einam HaZikanim HaNaskarim Tchila, these cannot be the Zikanim mentioned earlier, Ki HaMalachim Lo Yhalchu Lefanav. For it wasn't the kings of Midian that went to Bilam. Rak Sarim, they were officers, because if you look in Pasuk Ches, they're called officers. So it comes out a little bit difficult according to the Ibn Ezra, that the Ziknei Midian referred to in the beginning of the Sedra are not the same Ziknei Midian referred to a few psukim down. In the beginning, the Ziknei Midian referred to the kings. But then when the Ziknei Midian went with the Ziknei Moav, those were not the kings, those were just officers. However, the Ramban offers a different approach. Says the Ramban, V'adas Rabbi Seinu Zechorim Levracha, in accordance with the opinion of our Chachamim of blessed memory, Shamru, they say, Manhigan shel elu b'Midian nisgadel. The Medrash Tanchuma, the Medrash Rabbah says that the reason why Moav turned to Midian is because they knew the leader of the Jewish people, namely Moshe, grew up in Midian, and they knew, the people of Midian knew Moshe, and perhaps they would have the right angle and vantage point of how to deal with him. So therefore, Roi lahem l'shloach el ziknei Midian, it was appropriate for them to send to the elders of Midian, loy lamelachim v'loy la'am, not to the kings and not to the people. Ki hazakanim heim hayoidim inyanei. It would be the elders, or perhaps the wise men, either who remembered Moshe or who had the intuition and the seichel and the ability to read and understand and the perception to recognize who Moshe Rabbeinu was. And therefore the Ramban in fact learns that because Moshe grew up, explaining Chazal, the Ramban understands that because Moshe grew up in Midian, so they sent not to the kings. The kings may not know who Moshe was, but they sent to the older, sagacious men who had recognized Moshe Rabbeinu. However, the Ramban offers his own interpretation to this question of why does the Moavim did not send to the Melachim, but rather to the Zikanim. And that is, originally in Midian there were kings. However, V'sicha in Melech Amoiri, Sicha, the king of Amoiri, Nilcham b'Melech Moav Harishain. He waged war against the original king of Moav, Vayikach es kol artzah miyadei ad Arnoin, and he took the entire land of Moav until Arnoin. V'nilcham b'Bnei Amoin, and he then warred against the Bnei Amoin, V'lakach mei artzam, and he took from their land. So the Sichain waged war against Moab, he took their land. He then waged war against Ammon and he took their land. How do I know that? Like the king of Ammon said to Yiftach, Israel took my land, and Yiftach said, no, he didn't. And Yiftach responded, no, we didn't take your land. We took the land from Sichain, who took it from you. So from here we see that Sichain took not only the land of Moab, but took the land of Ammon. And Uchsiv Yoshua, and it says in Sefer Yoshua, Vayihi lohem hagvol Yazer, the border of Shevet Gad was Yazer, V'chol Orei HaGilad, and all the cities of Gilad, V'chatzi Eretz B'nei Ammon, and half the land of the children of Ammon, Ad Aroyer, until Aroyer, V'nilcham Sichain Oid Imalche Midian, V'kavash Artsam. And then, just like Sichain waged war with Moab and with Ammon, they also waged war with the kings of Midian, and he conquered their land. And when a power conquers a country that has a king, B'sam oisam loyla avadim, and he made them servants, noisei mincha, paying tribute to him. Beheser ateres roisham, he removed the crowns of their head, v'lei nosen lahem hadar malchus, he did not give them the splendor of royalty. In other words, when Sichain conquered the land of Midian, he removed their royal vestiges, and Shiurim shoiftim eretz Midian ba'avurai, and he left them as rulers in his place. V'lachein yikaru ziknei Midian. Now they're no longer the Malchei Midian; they're called the elders of Midian. Kederech hashara el hazakenim, like it says regarding the elders to the gate to the elders. So we see elders are referred to as shoiftim, where they judged. V'haraya bazeh, the proof to this. Shekasav b'Yoshua, it says in Sefer Yoshua, B'chol mamluchos Sichain melech Amori, the kingdom of Sichain, the king of Amori, Asher Malach b'Cheshbon, who ruled over Cheshbon, Asher Hika Moshe Osai, that Moshe smote him, v'yes Nesiei Midian, and the princes of Midian, es Evi, v'yes Rekem, v'yes Tzor, v'yes Chor, v'yes Reva, Nesichei Sichain Yoshvei Haaretz, they were princes or dukes of Sichain, the residents of the land. So first they're called princes of Midian, and then they're called the dukes of Sichain. Why are they called the dukes of Sichain? They were the princes of Midian. The answer is Ki hoisa tachas memshaltai. These 5 princes of Midian are called the dukes of Sichain because originally they were kings, and then they were conquered by Sichain, and he removed the crown of their head, and now they are merely Zikanim. Well, the Ramban is bothered because when these 5 rulers were killed, Evi, Rekem, Tzur, Chor, and Reva, then they're called Malchei Midian. The Tambias Malchei Midian. Why in Parshas Pinchas does it talk about the kings of Midian? Nesichei Sichain. Asher Hayu Malach, says the Ramban, V'tambes Malchei Midian, Asher Hayu Malachim Tchila. What it means is they were originally kings, but not that now they were king, they lost their royalty. K'maisha Amar, Nesiei Midian, Nesichei Sichain. Just like it says, princes of Midian, dukes of Sichain, they're originally princes of Midian, and they're also called V'chei Nemar, Roish Umais Beis of B'Midian, who one of the kings of Midian is called, namely Tzur, was called a head of the peoples of a father's house in Midian. Loi Melech, he's not called a king because he lost his royalty. He's only the leader of a tribe. But at their death they're called kings because at once they were kings. Or another pshat, the Ramban says, Oishayia tam malchei Midian. It could be another reason they're called malchei Midian. Shechazul malchusam ba'isahi. Maybe before their death, they were elevated and reverted back to the status of melachim. Okay, the Ramban continues. The Ramban is bothered now that this pasuk, Vayomer Moav el Ziknei Midian, Atei lachachil hakal. Moav said to Ziknei Midian. The pasuk ends, Uvalak ben Sipar melech leMoav isahi. Balak ben Sipar was the king of Moav at that time. Now, this is not the introduction to Balak in the Parsha. The first pasuk begins, Vayar Balak ben Sipar. So why introduce him and then give his title a few psukim later? It should say, Vayar Balak ben Sipar Melech Lamayav Eis Kasher Asa. Why introduce him and then a few psukim later give us his credentials? Says Ramban, V'lo yadati tam lamasha amar akasav uvalak ben Sipar Melech Lamayav Ba'esahi. I don't know the reason why the pasuk says, and Balak ben Sipar was the king of Moab at that time. Ki haroihu sheyamar tchila. It's more fitting that it should have said originally, Vayar Balak ben Sipar Melech Moab Eis Kasher Asa Yisrael La'amayri. So Ramban says as follows: V'ulai haya Balak gibar chayil. Maybe Balak was a well-known, strong, and mighty personality, a warrior. Noida ma'oid, very well known, b'masei sakpag v'rasai, for his might and his strength. V'hizkar hakasav, and the pasuk is therefore mentioning, not that you should know that he's a king. We know who he is. He's a mighty man. He's very well known. However, the Hizkar HaKasav, now the Torah is mentioning, even though Moav had at that time a mighty king, strong-hearted among the warriors, they were still afraid, and discussing with Bnei Yisrael. Meaning, the Parsha begins, Vayar Balak. We all know who Balak is. Everybody knows Balak is a mighty warrior. He's even a king. But in the context, a few psukim later, of the fright and fear of Moav, the pasuk is saying, despite the fact they had a mighty king, nevertheless Moav was still very frightened. Ulekach amar Yiftach. That is why Yiftach said to the king of Ammon, Hatoiv toiv atami Balak ben Tzipar melech Moav. Are you better than Balak, the son of Tzipar, the king of Moav? What he was saying was, you're not stronger than he is. You won't frighten a king only with another fearsome king. So therefore, Ramban says, Balak's a man who needs no introductions. We don't need to know he was a king in terms of his introduction. It's only mentioned and relevant in the context of the fear that Moav had. Despite the fact they had such a powerful king, they were still so frightened. However, the Ramban offers another pshat, similar to the Medrash. Says Ramban, V'yitachin, it is possible, ki Moav lo haya alei melech. Moav did not have a king over them at this point. And that's why in the opening of the Parsha, Vayar Balak ben Sipar, doesn't say he was a king, because he wasn't. He was just a warrior. V'haya ha'am yari ma'id. And the people were very scared, Bnei Yisrael, because of the Jewish people. V'asu shnei dvarim. And out of that fear, they did the following two things. Number one, Sholchu al Ziknei Midian. They sent a message to the elders of Midian. Ata yelachachu hakahal eskol svivasenu. Now, the kahal will lick up all of your surroundings. So they sent a message to Midian. And in response, they were told, V'yikim aleim hamelech hazeh b'atzas Midian. They established a king based on the council of Midian. And then, after Balak was appointed, the Ziknei Midian and Balak and the Ziknei Moav agreed that they should send word to Bilam. So therefore the Parsha begins, Vayar Balak ben Sipar. And what about the fact he was a king? He wasn't a king yet. But then, Vayakatz Moav, Vayagar Moav, Vayomer Moav al Ziknei Midian. What are we going to do? So they sent word to Midian. And then Midian said, make Balak the king. So Balak ben Sipar melech l'maya ba'esahi. V'zeh tam ba'esahi. That's the reason why it says at that time, B'hisyatzam b'inyan Yisrael. When they took counsel with Midian of what to do with the Jewish people, V'shalcham l'bilam, they sent them to Bilam. V'yiyatam, and the explanation is, Vayar Balak shahaya echad misarei Moav. And that he was one of the officers of Moav, V'gibar chayil, and a mighty and heroic man. Nevertheless, he wasn't yet the king. V'nis'or b'inyan hazeh, he sort of woke up to this issue. V'amar l'Moav, he said to Moav, Hava nischak mala'am, let's deal smartly with this people. In other words, the parsha begins like this. There's a well-known warrior named Balak. He was sensitive to the impending danger of Israel. He was the one who said, let's ask Midian what to do. And they did. They appointed him king based on the council of Midian. Now, this is similar to the Medrash, but not quite exactly like the Medrash. Uve Medrash b'midbar Sinai Rabba Isi, and in the Medrash b'midbar Rabba I saw, Balak ben Sipar melech l'Moav ba'Isahi. Balak, the son of Sipar, was the king of Moab at that time. But what do you mean? V'haloi mitchila nasachaya. Wait a second, the Ramban says, quoting the Medrash. But originally, he was not the king of Moab. He was a prince of Midian. Shenemar es Evi, v'es Rekem, v'es Tzur, v'es Chor, v'es Reva. And according to this Medrash, Tzur is Balak. Ela misheneherag Sichain himlichu aleim. When Sichain was killed, and Kal Yisrael killed Sichain, they appointed Balak over them. Va'es hahi, at that time, Shagar Maloisha, because of the situation of the time, Balak was appointed the king. So Ramban is learning different than his first pshat. In the first pshat, Balak was the king the whole time, but it wasn't necessary to mention until it was relevant to magnify the fact that despite having Balak as the king, they were still frightened. But according to this pshat, the Ramban learns originally he was not the king, and he was the one who was sensitive to the issue, and he became king by the advice of the Ziknei Midian. However, this is not exactly like the Medrash, because number one, the Medrash says that Balak was a prince of Midian, and the Ramban says explicitly that originally he was one of the Sarei Moav who was Nisoirer to the Jewish problem. Number two, the Medrash says that Balak became the king after Sichon was killed, and the Ramban is learning it was a little bit later upon the advice of the Ziknei Midian. But in general, this second shot of the Ramban is similar to the Medrash. Now, it is interesting to note that according to the Ramban, that originally Balak was from the officers of Moab. This would answer a question of the Maharit in Masechta Kedushin Daf Samach Zayin, who asked, based on Chazal, who learned that Balak was one of the officers of Midian. Then it comes out that Rus, a descendant of Balak, was not a Moabite, but rather a Midianite. And in that case, what's the whole issue? How could Rus marry into Klal Yisrael? We don't accept converts from Moab, and you have to say, they darshan Moavi v'loi Moavia. She's not a Moabite, she's a Midianite. She comes from Balak. Balak was Melech l'Moav ba'Esahi. But according to the Ramban, even the Ramban's second shot, when Balak became the king, but he was always from the Sarei Moav, he was always from Moab, hence his descendant Rus would also have been a Moabite. Okay, wishing everyone a wonderful week, and Shabbos Parshas Balak upcoming. Haba Aleinu L'Taiva.